When my boss told me that women couldn't handle high-pressure negotiations and that I was being pulled off the biggest deal of my career, he had no idea he was talking to someone who would soon own his company's biggest competitor. What happened next turned a moment of humiliation into the most satisfying business acquisition in Phoenix marketing history. And by the end of this story, you'll see how one man's prejudice became the catalyst for his own professional downfall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Amanda Rivera, and if you had asked me 6 months ago where I thought my career was heading, I would have painted you a picture of steady corporate climbing, maybe a VP title by 35, and the kind of success that comes from keeping your head down and delivering consistent results. I never imagined I'd be sitting in the CEO chair of Phoenix's fastest-growing marketing agency. But sometimes life has a way of pushing you toward the destiny you never knew you were meant. It was a humid September evening in downtown Phoenix when everything changed. The kind of evening where the heat still radiates from the concrete even after sunset, and the office buildings cast long shadows across Central Avenue. I was working, late again, which had become my standard routine over the past 3 years at Meridian Marketing Solutions. The 23rd floor had that peculiar quiet that only comes after most people have gone home, leaving behind the soft hum of computers and the distant sound of elevators carrying the last few workaholics down to the parking garage. I had spread, across my desk, what I considered to be my masterpiece. 3 months of research, relationship building, and strategic planning had culminated in a comprehensive proposal for Southwestern Industries, a manufacturing giant that represented the largest potential contract our agency had ever pursued. $15 million over 2 years. The kind of deal that could transform not just quarterly numbers, but the entire trajectory of a company. The proposal wasn't just numbers on spreadsheets or generic marketing speak. I had spent weeks understanding their industry challenges, their competitive landscape, and their internal culture. I had attended 3 industry conferences, not as a vendor trying to sell something, but as someone genuinely interested in understanding their world. I had built relationships with their procurement team, their marketing director, and even managed to have coffee with their VP of operations during a chance encounter at a downtown restaurant. This wasn't luck or good timing. This was the result of systematic relationship building, the kind that happens when you treat potential clients as human beings rather than walking checkbooks. I understood their seasonal fluctuations, their expansion plans for their Tucson facility, and their concerns about maintaining brand consistency across multiple market segments. Every page of my proposal addressed a specific pain point I had uncovered through careful listening and genuine curiosity about their business. The financial projections alone had taken me 2 weeks to perfect. I hadn't just estimated what we could deliver in terms of leads or brand awareness. I had created detailed models showing how our integrated approach would impact their customer acquisition costs, their lifetime value metrics, and their market share in 3 key demographics. I had included case studies from similar manufacturing companies, but more importantly, I had identified unique opportunities specific to their business that no cookie-cutter approach could have uncovered. Beyond the technical aspects, I had crafted a creative strategy that would position Southwestern Industries not just as another manufacturer, but as innovators in sustainable production methods. Their CEO, Margaret Foster, had mentioned in a recent industry interview her commitment to environmental responsibility, and I had built an entire campaign around showcasing how their manufacturing processes could be a competitive advantage rather than just a cost center. The presentation deck itself was a work of art, not flashy or overly designed, but clean, professional, and focused on substance. Each slide built upon the previous one, creating a narrative that moved from problem identification through solution architecture to implementation timeline and expected outcomes. I had even included a detailed breakdown of how success would be measured, with specific KPIs tied to their existing business metrics, rather than vanity metrics that sounded impressive but didn't connect to actual business value. I was reviewing the executive summary one final time when I heard the distinctive sound of expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished concrete floors. Richard Blackwood, our CEO and founder, had a particular way of walking that announced his presence before he appeared. At 58, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had built a successful business from nothing. But lately, that confidence had taken on an edge of arrogance that made interactions with him increasingly uncomfortable. Richard had started Meridian 15 years ago with nothing but a used laptop and determination. I respected that origin story, and for my first year at the company, I had genuinely admired his entrepreneurial spirit and hands-on leadership style. But success had changed him, or perhaps it had simply revealed aspects of his personality that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of professional charm. He appeared in my doorway without knocking, which had become his habit over the past few months. There was something about his body language that immediately put me on edge. His usual confident smile was replaced by something that looked almost predatory, and he held a manila folder in his left hand like it contained either very good news or very bad news. "Amanda," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk about Southwestern." My stomach tightened, but I maintained my professional composure. "Of course, I was just doing a final review of the proposal. I think you're going to be impressed with what we've put together." The research phase revealed some opportunities that could make this even bigger than our initial projections suggested. Richard's expression didn't change. If anything, his smile became more pronounced, but not in a way that suggested shared excitement about the opportunity ahead of us. "That's exactly what I want to discuss," he said, opening the folder and glancing at whatever documents it contained. "I've been thinking about the presentation strategy for next week, and I've decided to make some changes to the team structure." The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I had been preparing for this presentation for months, had built every relationship that made it possible, and had crafted every element of our approach based on insights that could only have come from my direct involvement in the discovery process. The idea that there would be changes to the team structure at this point in the process made no sense from a business perspective. "What kind of changes?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the growing sense of unease. Richard leaned back, in his chair, clearly enjoying the moment in a way that made my skin crawl. "I'm pulling you off the account effective immediately. James Morrison is going to take over as lead on the presentation and the ongoing relationship." The words hit me like a physical blow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. James Morrison was a competent account manager, but he had been with the company for less than 2 years and had never managed anything approaching this level of complexity or value. More importantly, he had no relationship with anyone at Southwestern Industries and no understanding of the nuanced approach we had developed based on months of careful research and relationship building. "I don't understand," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Is there a problem with my work on this account? Because every interaction we've had with their team has been extremely positive, and the preliminary feedback on our strategic approach was enthusiastic." Richard's smile widened, and I realized with growing horror that he was enjoying this conversation. "Your work has been fine, Amanda. This isn't about performance. This is about positioning for success." "What does that mean exactly?" He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the Phoenix skyline as if he were delivering a speech to the city, rather than having a conversation with the person who had made this opportunity possible. "Margaret Foster is old school," he said without turning around. "She's been in manufacturing for 30 years, came up through the ranks when it was even more of a man's world than it is today. She respects strength, decisiveness, and what I'll call traditional business leadership." I felt something cold settling in my stomach as I began to understand where this conversation was heading. "James has the kind of presence that resonates with executives like Margaret," Richard continued, still facing the window. "He has gravitas, authority, the ability to command a room when the stakes are high. These big deals require a certain kind of energy, Amanda. They require someone who can match the intensity of a $15 million decision. He turned back to face me, and the expression on his face was one I had never seen before. It was condescending in a way that went beyond professional disagreement, into something more personal and more insulting. "Look, you're excellent at the relationship building side of things," he said, settling back into his chair. "You're great at making people feel comfortable, at gathering information, at all the preliminary work that makes these deals possible. But when it comes to closing, when it comes to standing in front of a CEO and asking for $15 million, that requires a different skill set entirely." The room felt like it was shrinking around me. 3 years of 60-hour weeks, of consistently exceeding targets, of building Meridian's reputation in the Phoenix market. And this was how my contributions were being characterized: as preliminary work that someone else would need to finish. "Richard, I've closed deals before. The Peterson Group was $8 million, and the hospital network was $6 million. I've presented to CEOs, I've negotiated complex contracts, and I've consistently delivered results that exceeded projections." He waved, his hand dismissively as if my track record was irrelevant to the conversation we were having. "Those were different," he said. "This is Southwestern Industries. This is Margaret Foster. She's not going to be impressed by relationship building and emotional intelligence. She's going to want to see someone who can match her intensity, someone who understands how power works in a room like that." The subtext was becoming impossible to ignore, but Richard wasn't finished. "Women are naturally better at the collaborative aspects of business," he continued, his tone taking on the quality of someone explaining a basic truth rather than expressing a personal opinion. "You excel at building consensus, at making people feel heard, at creating environments where everyone feels comfortable contributing. Those are valuable skills, and they're exactly why you've been so successful in the role you're in." He paused, clearly expecting some kind of response, but I was too stunned to speak. "But high-stakes negotiations are different," he went on. "They require a certain kind of assertiveness, a willingness to create tension when necessary, an ability to make people slightly uncomfortable in service of closing the deal. Frankly, women aren't naturally wired for that kind of confrontation. It's not a criticism, Amanda. It's just biology." The words hit me like a slap across the face. 3 years of professional respect, of being treated as an equal contributor to our team's success, had evaporated in the space of a 5-minute conversation. I was being reduced to a collection of gender stereotypes by someone who had never questioned my capabilities until this moment. "So James is taking over the presentation," Richard continued, oblivious to or unconcerned with the impact his words were having. "You'll brief him on everything you've learned about their business, help him understand the relationships you've built, and then step back while he handles the closing process." I took a slow breath, trying to process what I was hearing and figure out how to respond. Every instinct I had was screaming at the injustice of the situation, but I also understood that getting emotional would only confirm Richard's prejudices about women in high-pressure situations. "I see," I said finally, my voice carefully controlled. "And this decision is final?" "It is," Richard replied. "I know it might be disappointing, but I need you to trust my judgment on this. I've been building this business for 15 years, and I know what works in situations like this." I stood up slowly, gathering the proposal documents that represented months of my life and sliding them into a neat stack. "I understand your position, Richard. Thank you for explaining your reasoning." The surprise on his face was almost comical. He had clearly expected pushback, argument, or emotional distress. Instead, he was confronted with professional acceptance that left him slightly off balance. "I'm glad you understand," he said, standing as well. "This doesn't change anything about your value to the team, Amanda. You're still a crucial part of what we're building here." I walked around my desk and extended my hand for a professional handshake. I appreciate the clarification, I said. It helps me understand exactly where I stand. Richard shook my hand, clearly relieved that the conversation had gone more smoothly than he had anticipated. Good. I'll have James stop by tomorrow morning to get briefed on everything you've learned about their business. Of course, I replied. I'll make sure he has everything he needs. After Richard left my office, I sat back down at my desk and stared at the proposal that would now have someone else's name on it. The research I had conducted, the relationships I had built, the strategic insights I had developed, would all be credited to James Morrison, whose primary qualification for this opportunity was apparently his gender. But as I sat there in the quiet of the empty office, I realized that something had shifted inside me. The disappointment and anger I should have been feeling were being overtaken by something else entirely. A sense of clarity that I hadn't experienced in years, and a growing awareness that this moment wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning. What Richard didn't know, what nobody at Meridian knew, was that Amanda Rivera wasn't just a marketing director climbing the corporate ladder. For the past 2 years, I had been quietly learning a very different set of skills from someone who understood exactly how power really worked in the business world. My mentor had been teaching me to read balance sheets like novels, to understand market dynamics like weather patterns, and to recognize opportunity in places that others saw only obstacles. The conversation with Richard had revealed something important about the limitations of trying to succeed within systems that would never truly respect my contributions. But it had also clarified exactly what my next move needed to be. I opened my laptop and began typing an email that would change everything. The email I was composing wasn't going to Richard or James or anyone at Meridian Marketing Solutions. Instead, I was writing to someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Someone who had spent the last 2 years preparing me for an opportunity I hadn't even known I was seeking. Dr. Carmen Vasquez had been my professor during my MBA program at Arizona State, but our relationship had evolved far beyond the typical student-teacher dynamic. Carmen had built and sold 3 successful companies before transitioning into academia, and she had an uncanny ability to identify entrepreneurial potential in her students. More importantly, she had an equally sharp instinct for recognizing when someone was ready to stop playing by other people's rules and start writing their own. 2 years ago, Carmen had approached me after a particularly heated class discussion about gender dynamics in corporate leadership. While other students had debated theory and statistics, I had shared specific examples from my own experience at Meridian, describing situations where my contributions had been minimized or attributed to male colleagues. Carmen had listened with the intensity of someone hearing something that confirmed a hypothesis she had been developing. After class, she had asked me to stay behind for what I assumed would be a brief conversation about my participation in the discussion. Instead, she had closed the door to her office and asked me a question that had been echoing in my mind ever since. Amanda, how long are you planning to let other people define the limits of your potential? The question had caught me off guard because it suggested possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider. At that point in my career, I had been focused on advancement within existing structures, on proving myself worthy of opportunities that other people would decide to give me or withhold based on their own biases and limitations. Carmen had seen something different. She had recognized that my frustration with corporate limitations wasn't a character flaw to be managed, but rather a signal that I was outgrowing the environments where I was trying to succeed. Over the following months, she had begun introducing me to concepts and connections that existed far outside the world of traditional employment. The first thing Carmen had taught me was how to read financial statements not as abstract collections of numbers, but as stories about businesses, their strengths, their vulnerabilities, and their potential. She had shown me how to identify companies that were undervalued, not because they were failing, but because they were being managed by people who didn't understand their true worth. Under her guidance, I had learned to analyze market conditions, competitive landscapes, and industry trends with the perspective of someone looking for acquisition opportunities rather than employment prospects. Carmen had introduced me to a network of investors, business brokers, and strategic advisors who moved in circles I had never known existed. More importantly, she had been helping me build the financial foundation that would make independent action possible. Through her connections, I had begun making small investments in local businesses, learning to evaluate opportunities and understanding how capital could be leveraged to create both financial returns and strategic advantages. The portfolio we had built together over the past 2 years wasn't enormous by institutional standards, but it represented something more valuable than just money. It represented options, independence, and the ability to make choices based on my own vision rather than someone else's permission. My email to Carmen was brief but loaded with significance. The conversation we've been preparing for just happened. I think it's time to move forward with the plan we discussed. Are you available to meet tomorrow morning? Her response came back within minutes, even though it was well past normal business hours. I've been wondering when this moment would arrive. My office at 8 a.m. Bring everything you've learned about your current company's competitive landscape. I think you're going to find our next steps very interesting. I closed my laptop and gathered my personal belongings from the office, leaving behind the Southwestern Industries proposal and 3 years' worth of accumulated corporate materials. Walking through the empty office toward the elevators, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Instead of the weight of other people's expectations and limitations, I felt the lightness that comes from finally understanding your own power. The next morning, I arrived at Carmen's office to find her already reviewing a stack of documents that I recognized as business acquisition reports. Her office had always impressed me with its combination of academic credentials and entrepreneurial energy. The walls displayed her PhD in business strategy, alongside photos of her shaking hands with CEOs whose companies she had either built or acquired. "So," Carmen said without preamble as I settled into the chair across from her desk, "tell me exactly what happened yesterday." I walked her through the entire conversation with Richard, from his dismissal of my role on the Southwestern account to his casual explanation of why women weren't suited for high-stakes negotiations. Carmen listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with an expression that combined sympathy with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Amanda, in the 2 years we've been working together, I've watched you develop every skill necessary to build and run a successful business. The only thing you've been missing is the catalyst that would push you to actually do it. It sounds like Richard just provided exactly that." She opened one of the folders on her desk and pulled out a document that immediately captured my attention. It was a business profile for Apex Strategic Marketing, a boutique agency that I knew by reputation as Meridian's primary competitor in the Phoenix market. "Tell me what you know about Apex," Carmen said. I had been tracking their activities for years as part of my competitive analysis responsibilities at Meridian. Apex had been founded 12 years ago by Victoria Chen, a former executive from a major advertising conglomerate who had decided to build something more personal and more focused on client relationships than pure profit maximization. Under Victoria's leadership, Apex had developed a reputation for creative excellence and client satisfaction that consistently won them business that larger agencies couldn't secure. Their team was smaller than Meridian's, but they commanded higher fees and had virtually zero client turnover. More importantly, from a cultural perspective, Apex was known throughout the industry as a place where talented people could do their best work without having to navigate the kind of political nonsense that plagued larger organizations. Victoria. "Chen built something special there," I told Carmen. "They're probably the only agency in Phoenix that could legitimately compete with us for the Southwestern Industries account. And honestly, they might have a better chance of winning it." Carmen smiled in a way that suggested she knew something I didn't. Victoria announced her retirement 6 months ago. She's been looking for the right buyer, someone who shares her vision for what the agency could become under new leadership. The implications of what Carmen was suggesting began to dawn on me slowly, like sunrise gradually illuminating a landscape that had been hidden in darkness. "You're not seriously suggesting that I should consider acquiring Apex," I said. Though, even as the words left my mouth, I could feel my mind beginning to explore the possibilities. "I'm not suggesting anything," Carmen replied. "I'm simply providing information that might be relevant to whatever decisions you choose to make about your future." She pulled out another document, this one a detailed financial analysis of Apex's performance over the past 5 years. The numbers were impressive in ways that went beyond simple revenue growth. Apex had consistently higher profit margins than industry averages, lower employee turnover than any comparable agency, and client retention rates that bordered on the extraordinary. More importantly, the analysis revealed that Apex was significantly undervalued based on traditional acquisition metrics. Victoria's desire to find a buyer who would preserve the company culture she had built meant she was prioritizing fit over maximum financial return. "The asking price is reasonable," Carmen continued, "especially for someone who understands the strategic value of acquiring an established client base, a proven team, and a reputation that takes decades to build." I studied the financial projections, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with my understanding of my own resources and capabilities. The numbers were substantial, but not impossible, especially with the investment portfolio Carmen had helped me build and the additional financing options she had been teaching me to evaluate. "Even if the acquisition were financially feasible," I said, "I don't have experience running an entire agency. There's a difference between managing accounts and managing a business." Carmen leaned back in her chair, and I recognized the expression on her face as the same one she wore when a student was on the verge of understanding a concept that would change their entire perspective. "Amanda, over the past 2 years, you've learned financial analysis, strategic planning, market evaluation, and team leadership. You've been managing client relationships worth millions of dollars, developing business strategies that drive revenue growth, and consistently outperforming colleagues with more experience and supposedly better credentials." She gestured toward the Apex documents spread across her desk. "The only difference between what you've been doing at Meridian and what you would be doing at Apex is that at Apex, your decisions would be final rather than subject to approval by people who don't understand your work as well as you do." The conversation was shifting something fundamental in how I thought about my own capabilities and limitations. For 3 years, I had been seeking validation and advancement within structures that would always view me as a supporting player rather than a lead actor. The possibility Carmen was presenting would eliminate that dynamic entirely. "There's something else you should know," Carmen said, pulling out a final document from her folder. "I've been in contact with Victoria Chen about her succession planning. When I mentioned that I had a former student who might be interested in carrying forward her vision for the agency, she expressed interest in meeting." The document was an email exchange between Carmen and Victoria, discussing the qualities Victoria was looking for in a potential successor. Reading through their conversation, I was struck by how closely Victoria's priorities aligned with my own frustrations about the marketing industry. She wanted someone who valued client relationships over quick profits, who understood that sustainable growth came from doing excellent work rather than aggressive sales tactics, and who could preserve the collaborative culture that had made Apex successful. More intriguingly, Victoria had specifically mentioned her concerns about selling to a larger agency or corporate buyer who might prioritize efficiency over the human elements that had made Apex special. She was looking for an individual with the vision and commitment to maintain what she had built while having the skills to grow it further. "She's willing to meet next week," Carmen said, "but only if you're serious about this possibility." I looked at the documents spread across Carmen's desk, trying to process the magnitude of what was being presented. 24 hours ago, I had been a marketing director focused on advancing within someone else's company. Now I was being offered the opportunity to acquire and lead an established business that could become whatever I had the vision and capability to make it. The financial risk was real, but manageable. The professional challenge was significant, but not beyond my abilities. The strategic opportunity was extraordinary, especially considering the timing relative to my situation at Meridian. But there was something else driving my interest that went beyond financial projections and strategic advantages. The possibility of building something that operated according to my own values rather than constantly fighting against other people's limitations was profoundly appealing. "I want to meet with Victoria," I said finally, "but I also want to understand exactly what kind of timeline we would be looking at if I decided to move forward." Carmen smiled, and I could see that she had been hoping for exactly this response. "Victoria is motivated to complete a transition before the end of the year for tax planning purposes. If you decide you want to proceed after meeting with her, we could potentially complete an acquisition within 60 to 90 days. The timeline was aggressive but not impossible, especially with Carmen's guidance and the network of professional advisors she had been introducing me to over the past 2 years. More importantly, it would allow me to make the transition before Richard and James had the opportunity to take credit for the relationships and strategies I had developed. "There's one more thing," Carmen said, her tone shifting to something more serious. "If you decide to do this, you need to be prepared for the reality that you'll be competing directly with your former employer. Meridian and Apex operate in the same market, serve similar clients, and often compete for the same opportunities." The implication was clear. Acquiring Apex wouldn't just be a career change, it would be a declaration of war against the company and the people who had underestimated my capabilities. "Actually," I said, thinking about Richard's condescending explanation of why women couldn't handle high-pressure negotiations, "I think that might be exactly the point." Carmen's smile widened, and I realized that she had been orchestrating this entire conversation to help me reach exactly this conclusion. "In that case," she said, reaching for her phone, "let me call Victoria and set up that meeting. I think you two are going to have a very interesting conversation." As Carmen dialed Victoria's number, I looked out her office window at the Phoenix skyline and tried to imagine what the city would look like from the perspective of someone who owned their own agency, rather than someone seeking approval from others. The view was the same, but something fundamental about my relationship to everything I could see was shifting. By the time Carmen finished scheduling my meeting with Victoria for the following Tuesday, I had made a decision that surprised me with its clarity and certainty. I wasn't just going to explore the possibility of acquiring Apex Strategic Marketing. I was going to do whatever it took to make it happen. The meeting with Victoria took place at her agency's offices in Old Town Scottsdale, a converted warehouse, space that had been transformed into something that felt more like a creative studio than a traditional corporate environment. The walls were covered with award-winning campaigns that Apex had developed for clients ranging from local nonprofits to Fortune 500 companies, and the energy in the space was immediately different from anything I had experienced at Meridian. Victoria Chen turned out to be a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of confidence that comes from building something meaningful rather than just profitable. She greeted me with genuine warmth and led me to a conference room that felt more like a comfortable living room than a formal meeting space. "Carmen tells me you're interested in carrying forward what we've built here," Victoria said once we had settled into chairs overlooking the agency's main workspace. "Tell me what draws you to Apex specifically." Over the next 2 hours, we discussed everything from business philosophy to operational details to long-term vision for the agency's future. Victoria asked probing questions about my experience, my management style, and my understanding of the challenges facing independent agencies in an increasingly competitive marketplace. What impressed me most about the conversation was Victoria's focus on cultural fit rather than just financial capability. She wanted to understand how I would treat the team she had assembled, how I would maintain relationships with clients who had become friends over the course of years, and how I would balance growth ambitions with the values that had made Apex successful. By the end of our meeting, I understood why Apex had developed such a strong reputation in the Phoenix market. Victoria had built something that prioritized long-term relationships over short-term profits, that valued creativity and collaboration over hierarchy and competition, and that treated both employees and clients as human beings rather than resources, to be optimized. "I'm going to be direct with you, Amanda," Victoria said as our conversation wound down. "I've been approached by several larger agencies and corporate buyers who could offer significantly more money than an individual acquisition would involve, but money isn't my primary concern at this point in my career." She gestured toward the workspace visible through the conference room windows, where I could see a team of creative professionals collaborating on projects with an energy and enthusiasm that was noticeably different from the atmosphere at Meridian. "I built this place because I wanted to prove that you could run a successful business while treating people with respect and focusing on work that actually matters. I'm not interested in selling to someone who's going to optimize away everything. That makes Apex special." Victoria's words resonated with frustrations I had been carrying for years, but had never been able to articulate clearly. The possibility of leading an organization that operated according to principles I actually believed in was more appealing than any salary increase or corporate title I had ever considered. "If I were to acquire Apex," I said, "my priority would be preserving and strengthening what you've built here, not changing it to match someone else's idea of how an agency should operate." Victoria studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her evaluating not just my words, but my sincerity. "Carmen mentioned that you're currently employed by one of our competitors," she said finally. "How do you think your current employer would react to losing you to a direct competitor?" The question brought back the memory of Richard's dismissive explanation of why women couldn't handle high-pressure negotiations. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Richard had removed me from the biggest opportunity of my career because he believed I lacked the qualities necessary for success, and now I was exploring the possibility of acquiring his primary competitor. "I think my current employer has made it clear that they don't value my contributions as highly as I do," I replied. "Their loss could be your gain." Victoria smiled for the first time since our conversation had turned serious. "In that case, let's talk about next steps." The due diligence process for acquiring Apex Strategic Marketing turned out to be unlike anything I had imagined when Carmen first suggested the possibility. Victoria had maintained meticulous records of every aspect of her business operations, from detailed client histories spanning multiple years to comprehensive financial projections that demonstrated not just past performance, but realistic growth potential under new leadership. What struck me most during the weeks of document review was how differently Victoria had approached building her agency compared to the corporate environment I knew at Meridian. Where Richard focused on quarterly numbers and short-term revenue spikes, Victoria had consistently prioritized sustainable relationships that generated predictable income over extended periods. Her client retention rate of 94% over 5 years wasn't just impressive from a business perspective. It represented a fundamentally different philosophy about what success looked like in the marketing industry. The financial analysis that Carmen helped me conduct revealed that Apex was significantly more profitable per employee than Meridian, despite charging comparable rates for their services. The difference came down to efficiency and focus. Victoria had built systems that eliminated much of the administrative overhead and bureaucratic complexity that plagued larger agencies, allowing her team to spend more time on actual client work and less time on internal politics and redundant approval processes. More intriguingly, Apex's client base included several companies that I knew had previously worked with Meridian, but had switched agencies due to dissatisfaction with service quality or account management. Reading through the detailed case studies, Victoria had compiled, I began to understand patterns in why clients chose to leave larger agencies for boutique alternatives, and more importantly, what kept them satisfied with their decision over time. The team Victoria had assembled was equally impressive from both a talent and cultural perspective. Unlike the competitive internal dynamics I had grown accustomed to at Meridian, Apex operated more like a collaborative workshop where individual strengths were leveraged to create collective excellence. Senior staff regularly mentored junior team members. Account strategies were developed through group brainstorming rather than top-down directives. And creative work was treated as an iterative process that benefited from multiple perspectives, rather than individual genius. During my second meeting with Victoria, she arranged for me to spend a full day observing the agency's operations firsthand. I sat through client calls, strategy sessions, and creative reviews, getting a realistic sense of how the business actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. What impressed me most was the level of genuine enthusiasm that staff members brought to their work and their obvious respect for Victoria's leadership style. The hardest part about retiring, Victoria confided during lunch that day, isn't leaving the business itself. It's knowing that the people who work here have built something special together, and hoping that whoever takes over will understand what makes it work. Her concern was evident and completely understandable. Apex wasn't just a collection of client accounts and revenue streams. It was a community of professionals who had chosen to work there specifically because of the culture Victoria had created. Any change in leadership would inevitably alter that dynamic, and there was no guarantee that the changes would be positive. "How do you think the team would react to new ownership?" I asked. Victoria considered the question carefully before responding. "I think it would depend entirely on how the transition was handled and what kind of leader they were getting. These are smart, talented people who have options. They stay at Apex because they believe in what we're doing here, not just because they need jobs." The implication was clear. If I acquired the agency but failed to maintain the culture that made it successful, I would likely lose the very people who created its value in the first place. It was a sobering reminder that buying a business was fundamentally different from buying assets. I would be inheriting relationships and responsibilities that went far beyond financial transactions. Over the following weeks, I began meeting individually with key Apex team members, not as a potential new owner, but as someone interested in understanding their perspectives on the agency's strengths and opportunities for growth. These conversations were revealing in ways that went beyond basic due diligence. Sarah Kim, Apex's creative director, had previously worked at 2 larger agencies before joining Victoria's team 3 years earlier. "The difference here," she explained during our coffee meeting, "is that creative work is treated as problem-solving rather than just making things look pretty. We're expected to understand client businesses well enough to create strategies that actually move their metrics, not just win awards." Her perspective aligned closely with my own philosophy about marketing effectiveness, and I found myself energized by the possibility of working with a team that shared similar priorities about substance over style. Marcus Thompson, the senior account director, had a particularly interesting background that included consulting experience with major corporations before transitioning to agency work. "Victoria built something here that most agencies talk about but never actually achieve," he told me. "We operate like strategic partners with our clients rather than vendors who execute their ideas. It makes the work more challenging but also more rewarding." These conversations helped me understand not just what made Apex successful, but what kind of leadership approach would be necessary to maintain and build upon that success. The team wasn't looking for someone to preserve everything, exactly as it was. They were hoping for leadership that would help them grow, without compromising the principles that made their work meaningful. The financial structuring of the acquisition turned out to be more complex than I had initially anticipated. But Carmen's network of advisors proved invaluable in navigating the legal and tax implications. Rather than a simple purchase transaction, we developed a structure that included both immediate payment and performance-based earnouts, that would provide Victoria with ongoing financial participation in the agency's success under new leadership. More importantly, the structure included provisions for Victoria to remain involved as a strategic advisor during the first year of new ownership, providing continuity for both clients and staff during the transition period. This arrangement addressed her concerns about abandoning the team she had built while giving me access to her institutional knowledge and industry relationships. The financing component required leveraging both my personal investment portfolio and additional capital from sources Carmen had been cultivating on my behalf. The investment wasn't small, but the financial projections we had developed showed clear paths to profitability that would support the debt service while funding growth initiatives I was already beginning to envision. By early November, we had reached preliminary agreement on all major terms of the acquisition. The legal documentation was being finalized, and I was beginning to develop transition plans that would allow me to leave Meridian while simultaneously taking ownership of their primary competitor. The timeline was aggressive, but everything seemed to be falling into place exactly as Carmen had suggested it would. That's when Richard made a decision that changed everything. I was working late on a Thursday evening, ostensibly reviewing client reports but actually researching Apex's competitive positioning in preparation for my imminent career transition, when Richard appeared in my office doorway with an expression I had never seen before. Instead of his usual confident swagger, he looked genuinely concerned, almost desperate. "Amanda, I need to talk with you about something important." The tone was different from our previous interactions. Gone was the condescending authority he had displayed when removing me from the Southwestern Industries account. This sounded more like a request than a directive. "Of course," I replied, closing my laptop and giving him my full attention. Richard entered my office and closed the door behind him, which immediately put me on high alert. In 3 years of working together, he had never felt the need for privacy during our conversations, unless he was delivering particularly bad news. "I want to talk about the Morrison situation," he began, settling into the chair across from my desk with obvious discomfort. James Morrison had been struggling with the Southwestern Industries presentation even more dramatically than I had predicted. According to office gossip, his initial meeting with their executive team had gone poorly enough that they had requested a different primary contact for future interactions. More damaging from a business perspective, Margaret Foster had apparently expressed concerns about Meridian's ability to understand their industry needs based on the questions James had asked during their strategy session. "What about it?" I asked, maintaining a neutral tone despite my growing satisfaction with the situation. "Look, I may have made an error in judgment," Richard admitted, the words clearly difficult for him to say. "James doesn't have the same depth of understanding about their business that you developed during the relationship building phase." The admission was remarkable, not just because Richard rarely acknowledged mistakes, but because of what it revealed about his growing desperation to salvage the Southwestern opportunity. $15 million represented approximately 20% of Meridian's annual revenue, and losing the deal would have significant implications for the company's financial performance and industry reputation. Margaret Foster specifically asked if you would be rejoining the account team, Richard continued. "Apparently she was impressed with your understanding of their operational challenges during your preliminary meetings." I allowed a moment of silence to emphasize the irony of the situation. 3 weeks earlier, Richard had explained to me that Margaret Foster would never respect a woman in high-stakes negotiations. Now he was telling me that she had specifically requested my involvement in the process. "I see," I replied. "And what would that involvement look like?" Richard leaned forward, his desperation becoming more obvious. "I want you to take back the lead on Southwestern. James can remain involved in a supporting role, but you would be the primary relationship manager and lead the final presentation." The offer was exactly what I would have wanted 3 weeks earlier, but the timing couldn't have been more ironic. Richard was asking me to save a deal that he had nearly destroyed through his own prejudices, just as I was preparing to leave his company to run his biggest competitor. That's an interesting proposition, I said carefully. Can I ask what changed your perspective on my capabilities? Richard's discomfort was evident as he struggled to find a way to explain his reversal without explicitly acknowledging the gender bias that had informed his original decision. I think I may have overestimated James's readiness for this level of responsibility, he said finally, and I may have underestimated the value of the relationships you had already built with their team. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get, and far more acknowledgement of error than Richard typically offered under any circumstances. The fact that he was willing to humble himself to this extent demonstrated just how concerned he was about losing the Southwestern account. I appreciate the confidence, I replied. But I have to ask whether this change in perspective extends beyond just this one account. Are you reconsidering your general assessment of women's capabilities in high-pressure business situations? The question made Richard visibly uncomfortable, which was exactly my intention. I wanted him to confront the contradiction between his previous statements about women's natural limitations and his current request for me to save his company's most important deal. I think each situation is unique, he said evasively. And I think you specifically have demonstrated capabilities that make you the right person for this particular challenge. The response was frustratingly typical of Richard's inability to acknowledge systemic issues in favor of treating everything as isolated incidents. But it also revealed something important about his mindset that would be useful for my future planning. Richard, I'm flattered by your confidence in my abilities, I said, choosing my words carefully. But I have to tell you that the way this situation was handled has caused me to reconsider my long-term future at Meridian. The statement was true, though not in the way Richard would interpret it. My future at Meridian had indeed been reconsidered, and I had concluded that it involved exactly 0 additional days of employment. What do you mean? Richard asked, clearly alarmed. I mean that being removed from my biggest account because of assumptions about my gender has made me question whether Meridian is the right place for me to build my career, I replied. I've been exploring other opportunities. Richard's face went pale. Losing me at this point would not only doom the Southwestern deal, but also eliminate one of his most productive employees during a period when the agency couldn't afford additional instability. Amanda, let's not be hasty, he said quickly. I understand that you're upset about how this was handled, and I take responsibility for the communication failures. But we can work through this. What would it take to keep you here? The question was exactly what I had been hoping to hear, though not for the reasons Richard assumed. Having him explicitly acknowledge my value and express desperation to retain me would make my departure significantly more impactful when it happened. I need to think about it, I said. The Southwestern situation was a symptom of larger cultural issues that concern me about working here long term. Richard nodded eagerly, clearly interpreting my response as an opening for negotiation rather than a polite way of saying that my decision had already been made. Of course, take all the time you need, he said. But please, don't make any permanent decisions without talking to me first. I think we can find a way to address your concerns. After Richard left my office, I sat back in my chair and considered the strange turn of events. 3 weeks ago, he had dismissed me from the account because women supposedly couldn't handle pressure. Now he was begging me to save a deal that his preferred candidate had botched and offering to negotiate whatever terms would keep me at the company. The irony was satisfying, but it also clarified something important about the timing of my transition to Apex. Rather than simply leaving Meridian for a better opportunity, I now had the chance to leave while Richard was maximally dependent on my contributions. The impact of my departure would be felt not just in terms of lost institutional knowledge, but in the immediate crisis it would create for the company's most important client relationship. I opened my laptop and composed a brief email to Victoria Chen, updating her on recent developments and suggesting that we accelerate our acquisition timeline. If Richard was this desperate to keep me, imagine how he would react when he discovered that I hadn't just left Meridian, I had acquired his biggest competitor. The response from Victoria came back within an hour, expressing enthusiasm for moving forward more quickly and suggesting a meeting the following week to finalize all remaining details. She also mentioned that several Apex team members had expressed excitement about the leadership transition, based on their interactions with me during the due diligence process. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my circumstances had changed over the past few weeks. A month ago, I had been a frustrated employee seeking recognition within someone else's company. Now I was days away from owning my own agency, with a proven team, established client relationships, and the opportunity to compete directly with the people who had underestimated my capabilities. But the most satisfying aspect of the situation wasn't the financial opportunity, or even the professional advancement. It was the knowledge that I would never again have to seek permission from people like Richard to pursue work that matched my abilities and ambitions. The acquisition of Apex Strategic Marketing was scheduled to close on the first Monday in December. I had given Victoria a firm commitment, signed the preliminary agreements, and arranged financing for the transaction. All that remained was finalizing the legal documentation and preparing for the ownership transition. I had also begun developing my resignation strategy at Meridian, timing it to create maximum disruption to Richard's plans while maintaining professional relationships with colleagues who had treated me with respect. The Southwestern Industries presentation was scheduled for the second week of December, which meant Richard would be counting on my involvement right up until the moment. I informed him that I was leaving to run his competitor. The weekend before the Apex acquisition closed, I spent Saturday afternoon walking through Old Town Scottsdale, visiting the office space that would become my new professional home. Victoria had arranged for me to have access to the building, so I could familiarize myself with the physical environment and begin envisioning how I wanted to organize my new role. Standing in what would become my office, looking out over the creative workspace where I would be leading a team that shared my values about meaningful work and professional respect, I felt something I had never experienced during my years at Meridian. Not just satisfaction or excitement about new opportunities, but a deep sense of alignment between my personal values and my professional environment. This was what it felt like to stop asking for permission and start taking responsibility for creating the kind of career I actually wanted. On Sunday evening, I drafted my resignation letter to Richard, timing it to be delivered first thing Tuesday morning, one day after the Apex acquisition became official. The letter was brief, professional, and carefully worded to avoid providing any advance warning about my new role as his competitor. By Monday morning, I would be the owner of Apex Strategic Marketing. By Tuesday morning, Richard would discover that his most valuable employee had not just quit, but had acquired his biggest competitor while he was begging her to save his most important client relationship. The only question remaining was whether he would finally understand the difference between what women could handle and what he had been capable of recognizing. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December weather that makes Phoenix feel like the desert paradise it's supposed to be. I woke up before my alarm, not from anxiety, but from the kind of anticipation that comes when you know your life is about to change in ways that will be visible to everyone around you. Today wasn't just about signing papers or transferring ownership. It was about stepping into a version of myself that I had been building toward for years without fully realizing it. The closing took place at the offices of Victoria's attorney, a sleek downtown firm that specialized in business acquisitions and mergers. The conference room overlooked the entire Phoenix Valley, and as I signed document after document transferring ownership of Apex Strategic Marketing to me, I could see Meridian's building in the distance, where Richard was probably arriving for another day of managing a company that was about to lose its most significant competitive advantage. Victoria sat across from me during the signing process, and I could see both satisfaction and melancholy in her expression. She was clearly proud of what she had built and confident in her decision to entrust it to me. But there was also the inevitable sadness that comes with ending a chapter of life that had defined her professional identity for over a decade. You "No," she said during a brief break in the paperwork process. "I started Apex because I wanted to prove that you could run a successful business while treating people with dignity and focusing on work that actually mattered. I'm glad it's going to someone who understands that those weren't just idealistic principles, but practical business strategies." Her words carried more weight than she probably realized. The contrast between her leadership philosophy and Richard's approach to management wasn't just a matter of personal style. It represented fundamentally different beliefs about what motivated people to do their best work and what created sustainable business success. By 11:30 that morning, I was officially the owner and CEO of Apex Strategic Marketing. The legal documents were filed, the financial transfers were complete, and I had the keys to an office building that contained everything I needed to compete directly with my former employer. More importantly, I had inherited a team of talented professionals who were genuinely excited about the leadership transition and eager to show me what they could accomplish under new ownership. My first official act as CEO was a staff meeting that Victoria had arranged for noon. I had been preparing for this moment for weeks, thinking carefully about how to introduce myself not just as their new boss, but as someone who intended to build upon everything that made Apex special while adding new capabilities and opportunities for growth. The entire team gathered in the main conference room, and I was struck by the energy in the space. Unlike the subtle tension that characterized most meetings at Meridian, there was genuine enthusiasm and curiosity about what came next. These were people who had chosen to work at Apex specifically because of its culture and values, and they were hoping that new leadership would strengthen rather than compromise what they had helped create. "I know that leadership transitions can be unsettling," I began, "especially when you've built something as special as what exists here at Apex. I want to start by assuring you that my priority is preserving and strengthening the culture that Victoria has created, not changing it to match someone else's idea of how an agency should operate." I could see visible relief on several faces around the room. These were smart people who had experienced corporate acquisitions before, and they knew how quickly new ownership could destroy everything that made a workplace meaningful. "That said," I continued, "I also believe that Apex has tremendous potential for growth that we haven't fully explored yet. My background includes experience with larger clients and more complex strategic initiatives than we've traditionally pursued, and I'm excited about the possibility of expanding our capabilities while maintaining our commitment to excellent work and collaborative relationships." Sarah Kim, the creative director, raised her hand. "Can you tell us about your background and what drew you to Apex specifically?" The question was exactly what I had been hoping someone would ask, because it gave me the opportunity to share my vision for the agency's future, while explaining how my experience would complement rather than replace what already existed. "I've spent the last 3 years as Senior Marketing Director at Meridian Marketing Solutions," I said, noting the surprised expressions around the room. Everyone in Phoenix marketing knew Meridian as Apex's primary competitor, and my previous employment there was clearly unexpected news. During that time, I managed accounts worth over $20 million annually and consistently exceeded performance targets. But I also became increasingly frustrated with a corporate culture that prioritized politics over performance and treated employees as interchangeable resources rather than valued collaborators. I could see that my candor about Meridian's cultural problems was resonating with several team members who had probably heard similar stories from colleagues throughout the industry. What attracted me to Apex wasn't just the business opportunity, I continued, but the chance to lead an organization that operates according to principles I actually believe in. Everything I've seen during the transition process has confirmed that this is a place where talented people can do their best work without having to navigate the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that plagues larger agencies. Marcus Thompson, the senior account director, leaned forward with obvious interest. "How do you think your experience at Meridian will inform your leadership approach here?" The question was perceptive and gave me an opening to address what I suspected were underlying concerns about how my corporate background might influence my management style. Working at Meridian taught me a lot about what doesn't work. I replied. I've seen how quickly toxic leadership can undermine even the most talented teams, and I've experienced firsthand how frustrating it can be to work in an environment where your contributions aren't valued or your potential isn't recognized. I paused to make eye contact with several people around the room. More importantly, it taught me to recognize and appreciate environments like this one, where people are treated with respect and given the autonomy to do excellent work. I have no interest in importing Meridian's dysfunction into a place that already works well. The conversation continued for another hour, with team members asking detailed questions about my vision for growth, my management philosophy, and my plans for maintaining client relationships during the leadership transition. By the end of the meeting, I could sense that the initial nervousness about new ownership had been replaced by genuine excitement about future possibilities. After the staff meeting, Victoria and I spent the afternoon going through operational details and client transition plans. She would remain available as a consultant for the next 6 months, but effective immediately. All strategic decisions and client relationships were my responsibility. There's one more thing I should mention, Victoria said as we wrapped up our final administrative discussions. Margaret Foster from Southwestern Industries called last week asking about our capabilities for large-scale strategic initiatives. Apparently, they're not entirely satisfied with their current agency relationship. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Southwestern Industries, the account that Richard had removed me from because women supposedly couldn't handle high-pressure negotiations, was now expressing interest in working with the agency I had just acquired. The opportunity to compete directly for the business I had originally developed was almost too poetic to be coincidental. "Did you provide them with any information about our services?" I asked. "I told them we'd be happy to discuss their needs once our leadership transition was complete," Victoria replied. "I thought you might want to handle that conversation personally." That evening, I sat in my new office after the rest of the team had gone home, preparing for what would be the most satisfying conversation of my professional career. My resignation letter to Richard was scheduled to be delivered first thing Tuesday morning, but I wanted to make sure every detail was perfect before I triggered what would inevitably be a dramatic response. The letter itself was brief and professional, expressing gratitude for the opportunities I had been given at Meridian, while explaining that I was leaving to pursue new challenges that better aligned with my long-term career goals. I carefully avoided any mention of Apex or my plans to compete directly with Meridian, preferring to let Richard discover those details through other channels. More importantly, I had prepared a comprehensive transition document outlining all of my current client relationships, ongoing projects, and strategic initiatives. The document was thorough enough to demonstrate my professionalism, but deliberately vague about details that would be crucial for maintaining client satisfaction during the handover process. If Richard wanted to retain the business I had developed, he would need to invest significant time and effort in rebuilding relationships that I had spent years cultivating. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of nervous energy that precedes major life changes. I dressed carefully in a tailored navy suit that projected both confidence and professionalism, knowing that this would be my final day as an employee rather than an owner. The symbolism of the moment wasn't lost on me. Exactly 1 week earlier, Richard had been begging me to save his most important client relationship, and now I was about to inform him that I had acquired his biggest competitor. I arrived at Meridian's offices earlier than usual, wanting to deliver my resignation letter before the normal business day began. Richard's assistant hadn't arrived yet, so I placed the sealed envelope on her desk with instructions that it should be delivered to him as soon as he arrived. Then I returned to my office and began the process of clearing out personal belongings while I waited for Richard's inevitable reaction. I packed carefully, taking only items that belonged to me personally while leaving behind anything that could be considered company property. The transition needed to be completely professional, regardless of how Richard chose to respond to the news. At exactly 9:15, my office phone rang. "Amanda, I need to see you in my office immediately." Richard's voice carried a tone I had never heard before, a combination of shock, anger, and something that sounded almost like panic. I walked to his office with measured steps, taking time to appreciate the familiar hallways and workspaces that I would never see again as an employee. Richard's door was open, and I could see him standing behind his desk holding my resignation letter, his face flushed with obvious agitation. "Sit down," he said without preamble as I entered his office. "I prefer to stand," I replied calmly. "This won't take long." Richard stared at me for several seconds, clearly struggling to process what was happening. "Amanda, what the hell is this?" He waved the resignation letter in the air. "It's my formal notice that I'm resigning from Meridian, effective immediately," I said. I thought the letter was fairly clear about that. "But we just talked about the Southwestern situation," Richard said, his voice rising. "You agreed to consider staying if we could address your concerns about the company culture." "I did consider it," I replied. "And I concluded that the fundamental issues I have with Meridian's approach to business and employee relations aren't things that can be addressed through individual negotiations." Richard slumped into his chair, looking genuinely bewildered. "I don't understand. Where are you going? What other opportunities?" The question was exactly what I had been waiting for, and I allowed myself a moment to savor the anticipation before delivering the news that would change everything. "I've acquired Apex Strategic Marketing," I said simply. "As of yesterday, I'm their new owner and CEO." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, and I could see him struggling to process the implications of what I had just told him. "You bought Apex?" he finally managed to say. "I did. The acquisition closed yesterday morning." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the credenza behind his desk. "This is impossible. You don't have that kind of money. You're a marketing director." "I was a marketing director," I corrected. "Now I'm a CEO. And you'd be surprised what's possible when you stop asking for permission and start taking responsibility for creating the opportunities you want." The realization of what had happened was beginning to dawn on Richard, and I could see multiple levels of understanding crossing his face simultaneously. He wasn't just losing an employee. He was facing the emergence of a new competitor led by someone who understood his business operations better than almost anyone else in the market. "Amanda, this is crazy," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "You can't seriously think you can run an entire agency. You've never managed a business before." The irony of his statement was remarkable. 3 weeks earlier, Richard had removed me from the Southwestern account because he believed women lacked the capabilities necessary for high-pressure business negotiations. Now he was questioning my ability to run a business, apparently oblivious to the contradiction in his position. "You're right that I've never been a CEO before," I said. "But I've spent the last 3 years learning every aspect of agency operations while working for you. I understand client relationship management, strategic planning, team leadership, and financial analysis. More importantly, I understand what doesn't work, based on extensive experience with dysfunctional management practices." Richard's face went pale as the full implications of the situation became clear to him. "The Southwestern account," he said quietly. "What about it?" "You developed that entire relationship. You understand their business better than anyone else here. If you're running Apex now..." I let him work through the logic himself rather than stating the obvious conclusion. Richard was beginning to understand that losing me wasn't just a personnel problem. It was a strategic catastrophe that threatened his most important client relationship and potentially several others. "Amanda, let's be reasonable about this," Richard said, shifting tactics toward negotiation. "I understand that you're upset about how the Southwestern situation was handled, and I take full responsibility for the communication failures. But acquiring a competing agency out of spite isn't going to solve anything." The suggestion that my acquisition of Apex was motivated by spite rather than strategic opportunity was both insulting and revealing. Richard still couldn't conceive of me as someone capable of making calculated business decisions based on market analysis and growth potential. "This isn't about spite, Richard," I said. "It's about building something that operates according to principles I actually believe in. Apex has a proven track record of treating both employees and clients with respect while delivering excellent results. That's the kind of organization I want to lead." "But what about loyalty?" Richard asked, grasping for arguments that might resonate. "What about the opportunities I gave you here? The experience you gained working for Meridian?" The question revealed how fundamentally Richard misunderstood both my motivations and the nature of professional relationships. He seemed to believe that I owed him continued employment in exchange for having been allowed to work at his company, as if my contributions hadn't generated significantly more value for Meridian than I had been compensated for. "I'm grateful for the experience I gained here," I replied. "It taught me valuable lessons about leadership, strategy, and what I want to avoid in my own business practices. In that sense, my time at Meridian has been an excellent education." Richard stared at me with an expression that combined disbelief with growing recognition that his attempts at persuasion were futile. "This is going to destroy our relationship with Southwestern Industries," he said finally. "That's possible," I agreed, though I should mention that they've already reached out to Apex expressing interest in our strategic capabilities. Apparently, they have some concerns about their current agency relationship. The news hit Richard like another physical blow. Not only was he losing the employee who had developed his most important client relationship, but that client was already exploring alternatives with his biggest competitor. "You can't do this," Richard said, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. "There have to be non-compete clauses in your employment agreement, legal restrictions on working with competitors." I had been expecting this argument and had already confirmed with my attorney that Meridian's standard employment agreements included only minimal restrictions that wouldn't prevent me from owning and operating a competing business. "I've reviewed my employment agreement thoroughly," I said. "There are no provisions that would prevent me from pursuing this opportunity." Richard slumped back into his chair, looking older and more defeated than I had ever seen him. The confident swagger that had characterized all of our previous interactions had been replaced by something that looked almost like shock. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why go to all this trouble just to compete with us?" The question suggested that Richard still didn't understand the real motivations behind my decision. He was interpreting my acquisition of Apex as a personal attack on him, rather than a strategic business decision based on opportunity and alignment with my professional values. "This isn't about competing with you, Richard," I said. "It's about building something better. Apex represents everything that I believe a marketing agency should be: focused on client success, committed to employee development, and dedicated to work that actually matters." I paused to let that sink in before continuing. "The fact that it happens to compete with Meridian is secondary to the opportunity to lead an organization that operates according to principles I respect." Richard looked up at me with an expression that combined anger, bewilderment, and something that might have been grudging respect. "You planned this entire thing, didn't you? The timing, the Southwestern account, everything." "I saw an opportunity, and I took it," I replied. "Just like you taught me to do during my time here." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on either of us. Richard had frequently emphasized the importance of recognizing and capitalizing on market opportunities, though he had probably never imagined that I would apply those lessons to competing with him directly. "What happens now?" Richard asked. "Now I go build the kind of agency I've always wanted to work for," I said. "And you figure out how to replace the institutional knowledge and client relationships that are walking out the door with me." I turned toward the office door, then paused to deliver one final observation. "Oh, and Richard? You might want to reconsider your assumptions about what women can handle under pressure. I'd say acquiring and running a business that competes directly with your former employer qualifies as fairly high-stakes decision-making." I walked out of Richard's office and through the Meridian workspace for the last time, nodding professionally to colleagues who would probably spend the rest of the day trying to understand what had just happened. By noon, word would spread throughout. The Phoenix marketing community that Amanda Rivera had acquired Apex Strategic Marketing and was now positioned to compete directly with her former employer. By the end of the week, 3 of Meridian's largest clients had scheduled meetings with Apex to discuss their strategic marketing needs. By the end of the month, 2 of those clients had terminated their relationships with Meridian and signed new contracts with my agency. The Southwestern Industries presentation that Richard had begged me to lead never happened. Margaret Foster canceled the meeting after learning about the leadership changes at Meridian and subsequently awarded their $15 million contract to Apex Strategic Marketing after a presentation that I delivered personally. 6 months later, Apex had grown from 45 employees to 78, had increased annual revenue by 60%, and had been recognized by Phoenix Business Journal as the fastest-growing marketing agency in Arizona. More importantly, our employee satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry, and our client retention rate remained above 90%. Richard's prediction that I couldn't handle the pressure of running a business turned out to be spectacularly wrong. What I couldn't handle was working for someone who consistently underestimated my capabilities based on outdated assumptions about gender and leadership. Meridian Marketing Solutions was acquired by a larger agency 18 months after my departure. Richard remained with the acquiring company in a reduced role for exactly 6 months before being quietly asked to resign due to what were diplomatically described as cultural fit issues. As for me, I discovered that the most satisfying aspect of building a successful business wasn't proving Richard wrong about women's capabilities. It was creating an environment where talented people could do meaningful work without having to navigate the kind of prejudices and limitations that had defined my experience at Meridian. Sometimes the best response to being underestimated isn't just proving someone wrong. It's building something so much better than what they offered that their limitations become irrelevant to your success. The view from the CEO's office at Apex. Strategic marketing includes the entire Phoenix Valley, and on clear days, I can see the building where I used to work for someone who thought women couldn't handle pressure. Every morning when I arrive at my own agency, surrounded by a team that shares my values about excellence and respect, I'm reminded that the most powerful form of revenge is living well and building something meaningful. Richard taught me many valuable lessons during my time at Meridian, though probably not the ones he intended. The most important was that when someone tells you that you can't handle something because of who you are, the best response isn't to argue with them. It's to prove them so completely wrong that they become a cautionary tale about the cost of underestimating people. The real test of any business transformation isn't the dramatic moment when everything changes, but the months and years that follow when initial enthusiasm either solidifies into sustainable success or crumbles under the weight of operational reality. As I settled into my role as CEO of Apex Strategic Marketing, I discovered that owning a company was fundamentally different from managing accounts within someone else's organization, and the learning curve was steeper than I had anticipated. The first major challenge came within 3 weeks of the acquisition, when I had to make a decision that would define the kind of leader I intended to be. Marcus Thompson, the senior account director who had impressed me during the transition process, came to my office with a problem that tested everything I claimed to believe about collaborative leadership and employee empowerment. "Amanda, we have a situation with the Henderson manufacturing account," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from my desk with obvious concern. "They're demanding that we fire Jennifer Walsh from their account team because they don't like her attitude during strategy meetings." Jennifer Walsh was one of Apex's most talented strategic analysts, a woman in her late 20s who had joined the agency straight out of graduate school and consistently delivered insights that exceeded client expectations. She was also direct in her communication style and unwilling to defer to client opinions that weren't supported by data, qualities that had apparently made Henderson's executive team uncomfortable. "What specifically are they complaining about?" I asked. Marcus pulled out his notes from the previous day's client call. "They say she's argumentative and doesn't show proper respect for their experience. Apparently, she questioned their assumptions about target demographics during last week's strategy session and provided research that contradicted their preconceptions about their market." The situation was uncomfortably familiar. Jennifer was being criticized for exactly the kind of analytical rigor and professional confidence that would have been praised if she were a man. Henderson Manufacturing represented approximately 8% of Apex's annual revenue, and their demand for her removal was essentially an ultimatum that would test whether I was serious about creating a different kind of workplace culture. "What's your recommendation?" I asked Marcus. "Honestly, Jennifer is right about the demographic analysis, and her strategic recommendations are solid. But Henderson is a significant client, and they've made it clear that they'll consider switching agencies if we don't accommodate their request." I understood the dilemma from a business perspective. Losing Henderson Manufacturing would be financially painful and might create uncertainty among other clients about Apex's commitment to customer service. But accommodating their demand would send an equally clear message to the team about what kind of leader I intended to be. "Set up a meeting with Henderson's CEO for tomorrow morning," I said. "I want to discuss this situation directly." The meeting with David Henderson took place at his corporate offices in Tempe, a sterile conference room that felt designed to intimidate vendors rather than facilitate collaborative discussions. Henderson himself was exactly what I had expected based on Marcus's description. A man in his early 60s who had built a successful manufacturing business through a combination of hard work and old-school management practices that hadn't evolved with changing professional norms. "Ms. Rivera, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me personally," Henderson began. "But I think the situation is fairly straightforward. We need account team members who understand their role and show appropriate respect for client preferences." I had prepared carefully for this conversation, bringing detailed documentation of Jennifer's contributions to the Henderson account and specific examples of how her analysis had improved their marketing effectiveness. "Mr. Henderson, I'd like to review some of the results we've achieved since Jennifer joined your account team," I said, opening the folder I had brought. Her demographic analysis led to a 23% increase in qualified leads for your industrial division, and her content strategy recommendations have improved your website conversion rates by 37%. Henderson glanced at the documents but didn't seem particularly impressed by the performance metrics. "Results are important, but so is working relationship dynamics. We need to feel comfortable with the people we're working with." The subtext was clear, and I realized that this conversation was about much more than Jennifer's communication style. Henderson was uncomfortable with a young woman who challenged his assumptions and refused to defer to his authority, regardless of how effective her work might be. "I understand the importance of comfortable working relationships," I replied. "But I also believe that the best client service comes from team members who are willing to provide honest analysis and strategic recommendations, even when those insights might challenge existing assumptions." Henderson's expression hardened. "Ms. Rivera, we're paying for a service, and we expect that service to be delivered in a manner that meets our expectations. If Apex can't provide that, we'll find an agency that can." The threat was explicit, and I could see that Henderson expected it to end the conversation in his favor. He was accustomed to vendors who would sacrifice employee dignity to maintain client relationships, and he assumed that I would follow the same pattern. "Mr. Henderson, I respect your position, and I understand your concerns," I said carefully. "But I also need to be clear about Apex's approach to client service. We're committed to delivering exceptional results through honest analysis and strategic expertise, That sometimes means providing insights that challenge conventional thinking. I closed the folder and looked directly at Henderson. Jennifer, Walsh is one of our most talented analysts, and her work has consistently delivered measurable improvements to your marketing performance. I'm not willing to remove her from your account team based on stylistic preferences that don't relate to professional competence. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Henderson stared at me with obvious disbelief, clearly unused, to vendors who would risk client relationships to defend employee interests. Are you telling me that you're choosing your employee over our business? Henderson asked. I'm telling you that we're choosing professional excellence over personal comfort, I replied. Apex's value proposition is built on providing strategic insights that drive business results, and that requires team members who are willing to challenge assumptions when data suggests better approaches. Henderson stood up abruptly, signaling that the meeting was over. Then I think we need to reconsider our relationship with Apex Strategic Marketing. I understand, I said, gathering my materials. I'm sorry that we couldn't find a solution that worked for everyone. As I drove back to the office, I reflected on what had just happened. I had potentially sacrificed 8% of Apex's annual revenue to defend an employee who was being criticized for qualities that should have been valued rather than suppressed. From a traditional business perspective, the decision was questionable. From the perspective of building the kind of agency I wanted to lead, it felt absolutely right. The news of Henderson Manufacturing's departure spread quickly through both Apex and the broader Phoenix marketing community. Some observers viewed my decision as evidence of poor business judgment, while others saw it as a principled stand that differentiated Apex from agencies that would compromise employee interests for client retention. More importantly, the decision had a profound impact on Apex's internal culture. Jennifer Walsh became one of our most dedicated and productive team members, and her confidence in challenging conventional thinking led to breakthrough strategies for several other clients. The entire staff understood that they would be supported when doing excellent work, even if that work made some clients uncomfortable. Within 6 weeks of losing Henderson Manufacturing, Apex had replaced their revenue with 2 new clients who were specifically attracted to our reputation for analytical rigor and strategic innovation. Both new relationships proved more profitable and collaborative than the Henderson account had been, confirming that sometimes losing difficult clients creates space for better opportunities. The Henderson situation became a template for how I approached similar challenges over the following months. When Phoenix Financial wanted us to replace Maria Santos, our Hispanic account coordinator, with someone who better reflected their company culture, I declined, and subsequently watched them become one of the most successful minority-owned businesses in Arizona under Maria's strategic guidance. When Southwestern Tech demanded that we remove Kevin Park from their account because his data analysis was too complicated, I instead walked them through his recommendations in detail and watched their market share increase by 42% over the following quarter. Each of these decisions reinforced Apex's reputation as an agency that prioritized professional excellence over client politics, and paradoxically, our willingness to lose difficult clients made us more attractive to the kind of organizations we actually wanted to work with. By the end of our first year under my ownership, Apex had grown from 45 employees to 93, had increased annual revenue by 112%, and had been recognized by multiple industry publications as both the fastest-growing agency in Arizona and the best place to work in Phoenix marketing. More significantly, our client retention rate had actually improved to 97% as we attracted businesses that valued collaborative relationships and strategic innovation over traditional vendor dynamics. The growth brought new challenges that tested my leadership capabilities in ways I hadn't anticipated. Managing a team of nearly 100 people required systems and processes that were far more complex than anything I had experienced at Meridian, and I found myself learning organizational management principles in real time while trying to maintain the culture that had made Apex successful. The solution came through embracing the collaborative approach that had always been Apex's strength. Rather than trying to centralize all decision-making through traditional hierarchical structures, I created cross-functional teams that gave senior staff members ownership over specific aspects of agency operations. Sarah Kim led creative strategy across all accounts. Marcus Thompson managed client relationship protocols, and Jennifer Walsh developed our analytical methodologies and quality standards. This distributed leadership model not only made the agency more efficient, but also created advancement opportunities that went beyond traditional account management roles. Team members could develop expertise in areas they were passionate about while contributing to the overall success of the organization, creating the kind of professional growth opportunities that had been lacking in my own experience at larger agencies. The model also attracted exceptional talent from throughout the Phoenix market and beyond. When word spread that Apex was promoting based on merit rather than politics, and that leadership roles were available to anyone who demonstrated capability and commitment, we began receiving applications from senior professionals at agencies throughout the Southwest. One of the most significant hires was Dr. Rachel Chen, a former McKinsey consultant who had been working as a strategic advisor for Fortune 500 companies, but wanted to transition into marketing strategy. Rachel brought analytical capabilities and corporate experience that elevated our ability to serve larger clients while maintaining the collaborative culture that defined Apex's approach. What attracted me to Apex, Rachel explained during her first staff meeting, was the opportunity to work with a team that valued strategic thinking over office politics. I've spent years in environments where the best ideas didn't always win, and I'm excited to be somewhere that prioritizes results over relationships. Her comment captured something important about what Apex had become under my leadership. We weren't just another marketing agency competing on price or convenience. We were building a reputation as the place where the most talented professionals came to do their best work without having to navigate the kind of bureaucratic dysfunction that plagued larger organizations. This reputation began attracting clients who were specifically looking for agencies that could provide Fortune 500-level strategic thinking while maintaining the responsiveness and collaboration that characterized boutique firms. Companies like Desert Industries, Phoenix Medical Systems, and Southwestern Industries Solutions chose Apex not because we were the cheapest option, but because we were the best at understanding their business challenges and developing solutions that delivered measurable results. The contrast with Meridian Marketing Solutions became increasingly apparent as both agencies competed for the same opportunities throughout the Phoenix market. Where Richard's approach emphasized volume and efficiency, Apex focused on depth and innovation. Where Meridian measured success primarily through revenue growth, Apex tracked client satisfaction, employee development, and long-term relationship sustainability alongside financial metrics. The differences in approach produced dramatically different outcomes. While Meridian continued to struggle with client retention and staff turnover, Apex was consistently recognized for both business performance and workplace culture. Industry publications began featuring our clients' success stories and management practices, and I was invited to speak at conferences about building sustainable growth through employee empowerment and strategic innovation. One of the most satisfying speaking opportunities came at the Arizona Marketing Association's annual conference, where I was asked to present on building competitive advantage through organizational culture. The audience included representatives from agencies throughout the state, including several former colleagues from Meridian, who had watched my transition from employee to competitor with obvious interest. The most important lesson I've learned about running a successful agency, I told the audience, is that your internal culture directly impacts your ability to serve clients effectively. When employees feel valued and empowered, they do better work. When they do better work, clients achieve better results. When clients achieve better results, they become advocates who drive referral business and long-term growth. The presentation included specific examples of how Apex's collaborative approach had led to breakthrough strategies for major clients, and how our commitment to professional development had reduced turnover costs while improving service quality. The data was compelling, but more importantly, the philosophy represented a fundamental alternative to traditional agency management practices. During the question and answer session, someone from the audience asked about the financial risks of prioritizing employee interests over short-term client demands, referencing my decision to lose Henderson Manufacturing rather than compromise team member integrity. The question assumes that employee interests and client interests are inherently in conflict, I replied. In my experience, the opposite is true. Clients benefit most from working with confident, empowered professionals who are willing to provide honest analysis and strategic recommendations. When you create an environment where employees can do their best work, clients receive better service, not worse. I paused to scan the audience, noting several familiar faces from my Meridian days. The agencies that struggle with this balance are usually the ones that haven't figured out how to attract clients who value strategic partnership over vendor compliance. When you work with the right clients, supporting your team and serving client interests become the same thing. The response from the audience was overwhelmingly positive, and several attendees approached me afterward to discuss potential collaboration opportunities or to ask for advice about implementing similar approaches at their own organizations. More significantly, 3 senior professionals from other agencies contacted me within the following week to explore employment opportunities at Apex. The conference presentation marked a turning point in how Apex was perceived within the Phoenix business community. We were no longer viewed as simply another marketing agency, but as a thought leader that was demonstrating new approaches to professional services and organizational management. This reputation began attracting speaking opportunities, consulting, requests, and strategic partnerships that elevated our profile beyond traditional client service relationships. One of the most interesting opportunities came from Arizona State University's Business School, which invited me to guest lecture on entrepreneurship and strategic management. Standing in front of a classroom full of MBA students who were preparing for their own careers in competitive business environments, I reflected on how different my perspective had become since my own graduate school experience. The most important advice I can give you about building a successful career, I told the class, is to never accept other people's limitations as definitive assessments of your potential. The business world is full of people who will tell you what you can't do based on their own biases and assumptions. Your job is to prove them wrong through performance, not arguments. I shared the story of my transition from Meridian to Apex, emphasizing the importance of building capabilities before needing them and recognizing opportunities when they presented themselves. Several students asked detailed questions about the acquisition process, the challenges of competing with former employers, and the practical aspects of building organizational culture in fast-growing companies. The hardest part about leaving Meridian wasn't the financial risk or the professional uncertainty, I explained. It was overcoming my own assumptions about what was possible. I had been thinking like an employee who needed permission to pursue opportunities, rather than like an entrepreneur who could create opportunities through strategic action. One student raised her hand with a question that brought everything full circle. How do you handle situations where clients or colleagues still underestimate your capabilities because of gender or other factors? The question was one that I continued to encounter regularly, despite Apex's success and my growing reputation in the Phoenix business community. The assumption that women needed to prove themselves differently than men remained embedded in many professional relationships, though it was usually expressed more subtly than Richard's explicit statements about women's capabilities under pressure. The most effective response to being underestimated, I said, is to build something so successful that the underestimation becomes irrelevant to your outcomes. You can spend energy trying to change other people's biases, or you can focus that energy on creating results that speak for themselves. I gestured toward the business school building around us. Every one of you will encounter people who make assumptions about your capabilities based on factors that have nothing to do with your actual potential. The question isn't whether that will happen. The question is how you'll respond when it does. The lecture concluded with a discussion about the importance of building networks and mentorship relationships that provide both practical support and strategic guidance during career transitions. I emphasized how crucial Carmen Vasquez's mentorship had been in helping me recognize and pursue the opportunity to acquire Apex, and encouraged students to actively seek out advisors who could help them see possibilities beyond their current circumstances. After the lecture, several students approached me with follow-up questions and requests for informational interviews. Their enthusiasm and ambition reminded me of my own graduate school experience, when I had been focused on landing the best possible job within existing corporate structures, rather than considering the possibility of creating my own opportunities. Driving back to Apex that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my perspective on success and professional fulfillment had evolved over the past 2 years. The transition from employee to owner had been about much more than financial outcomes or competitive positioning. It had fundamentally changed how I thought about my own agency and potential impact. As I pulled into the parking lot at Apex's offices, I could see lights still on throughout the building, indicating that team members were working late on client projects. But the energy was completely different from the late nights I had experienced at Meridian. These were people who were engaged with their work because they found it meaningful and challenging, not because they were afraid of disappointing managers who might question their commitment. The difference wasn't just philosophical. It was measurable in client outcomes, employee satisfaction, and business performance. Apex had become exactly what I had envisioned when I first considered acquiring Victoria's agency, a place where talented professionals could do their best work while building something that mattered beyond quarterly revenue targets. More importantly, the success had validated principles that went beyond business strategy to fundamental questions about how organizations should treat people and what kind of leadership actually creates sustainable excellence. The agency that Richard had dismissed as impossible for me to manage had become a model that other business leaders were studying and attempting to replicate. As I walked through the office toward my own workspace, I stopped to look at the wall where we displayed client success stories, team accomplishments, and industry recognition that Apex had received over the past year. The collection represented more than business achievements. It documented the transformation of an already successful agency into something that exceeded what any of us had thought possible. But the most satisfying element wasn't the external recognition or financial performance. It was the knowledge that every person who walked through Apex's doors each morning was working in an environment that valued their contributions, supported their professional development, and treated them with the kind of respect that should be standard in every workplace, but unfortunately remained exceptional in too many professional settings. The empire we had built wasn't based on dominance or competitive destruction, but on the simple recognition that business success and human dignity were not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing. When people felt valued and empowered, they created better outcomes for everyone around them. Standing in my office at the end of another successful day, looking out over the Phoenix skyline that included the building where Richard was probably working late, trying to rebuild the client relationships that had walked out the door with me, I understood that the most powerful form of victory wasn't defeating someone who had underestimated you. It was building something so much better than what they offered that their limitations became irrelevant to your success, and their assumptions became cautionary tales about the cost of failing to recognize potential when it was sitting right in front of them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.